Hi everyone, I'm Dave Patrick with the Chief Conservation Office. I'm really excited in this brief presentation to introduce you to our Theory of Change module, one of the modules available through the updated version of Conservation by Design. Before I go any further though, I do really want to appreciate and acknowledge the leadership of the Agility Lab who developed this module and took it through the testing process as part of that updated version of Conservation by Design, and really have helped us to make sure that this module really does meet the needs of our teams across our global reach. So let's start off then with making sure we're on the same page about what we mean when we say a theory of change. So in many ways, a theory of change is an overarching story of our strategy. Yeah? How do we expect that the actions we take along with our partners will lead to the change that we need to see in order to tackle the challenges that face us in this particular strategy? And how do we think that those actions sort of will lead to those outcomes? What's that sort of cause and effect? If we do this, it will lead to this, which should lead to this, and so on. And then lastly, it helps us to identify some of the assumptions that are inherent in those stories. So what has to be true in order for that chain of events to play out? So those are some of the key elements of our theory of change. It is that story. It's a story that can be used by the team to understand their work. And it's a story that can be used by the team to share with others how they expect their strategy will go and what some of the key elements of it are. So the purpose of this module then is pretty straightforward. This is a standalone module, as are all the modules available through the updated version of Conservation by Design, meaning that if you step into this module, you can either develop, if you haven't put your theory of change down on paper yet, so you can develop for the first time, or you can refine if you already have a theory of change you're looking to improve or to update your theory of change. And it is an initial draft theory of change that you can expect to have coming out of this module. So shown here in the figure are the 9 modules that have been developed through the updated version of Conservation by Design. And on the right-hand side of the figure here, you can see the 7 modules arranged in the typical order that a team would go through were they to be developing a strategy from scratch with no work sort of undertaken already. And you'll see in the blue arrow here then that the theory of change is arranged at near the end of this sequence of steps. The only module we have after that then is our monitoring, evaluation and learning module that really helps the team step into that space of adaptive management. Now, as I said though, all of these modules are standalone, and so most of the teams engaging with the updated version of Conservation by Design will choose among these different modules. They may take 2 or 3 on, they may only take a single module on. And some teams at least do jump straight into the theory of change, and that is sort of the beginning and end of their engagement with the modules, at least for this, for the first time that they're using these resources. So let's talk a little bit about what this module does do for our teams and critically what it doesn't do. Yeah. So this module does help the team to articulate their outcomes, what success looks like, their intermediate results, those key markers that will help us know are we on track to achieve the results we see, and our strategic approaches. And by that we mean the key actions that we along with our partners will be taking and that we think will lead to the outcomes we want to see. And then, as I mentioned, it also helps to articulate sort of our critical risks and hidden assumptions. And by risks, we're talking about, where are there uncertainties in that cause and effect logic? And how can we help hone in on those areas where we're really pretty uncertain whether or not that assumption is valid? And if it isn't valid, it really might affect our likelihood of being successful through the approaches we've identified in achieving the change we want to see. Now, what this module doesn't do is lead to a perfect theory of change. There is no such thing, and the world is constantly changing. So even if it was perfect at the point of it being put down on paper, it would cease to be perfect soon thereafter. Because the world is constantly changing and there's a lot of uncertainty out there, it also doesn't tell you exactly what you will need to do through the lifespan of a strategy in order to be guaranteed to achieve the success we want to see. It doesn't provide a prescriptive roadmap. It sets teams up for adaptive management, which will be necessary given that change and that uncertainty. And lastly, nor does it lead a team to have a monitoring, evaluation and learning plan at the end of the theory of change that can be immediately implemented in adaptive management. That is a step that comes after our theory of change for many of our teams. So let's talk a little bit about when you should use this module then. So as I mentioned, this is a standalone module. But we want to make sure that teams that jump straight into the theory of change really do gain value out of this experience. So our theory of change module does assume that teams have done some initial thinking. It assumes that they know what the scope is for their strategy. So you don't have strong divergence where some team members, for example, might think that it's a national strategy, others might think it's a continental scale strategy. It assumes that the team is aligned on the objectives. They know what success looks like for this body of work. They've identified the core challenges that they need to overcome, and they've identified that initial list of the actions or strategies that they're thinking of taking, and that where they see that there's the most evidence that those actions, those strategies will lead to the change that they wish to see. So those are assumptions that we have for teams that jump straight into the theory of change module. And if those assumptions are not valid, then the teams are going to get a lot less value out of that module. And we encourage teams then, if there are gaps, to go and look at some of the other modules available through Conservation by Design. So for example, if the team has a lot of divergence around key elements of scope, we encourage them to take the planning scope module. If they haven't defined what success looks like yet, we encourage them to take our defining objectives module, and so on. So in terms of who should participate, obviously we do really hope that the core team planning this and implementing this strategy is around the table in developing this theory of change. We have found that if you have less than 5 participants, more than 15 participants, there can be challenges that emerge. Obviously, less than 5 can mean that you just don't have enough diversity of perspectives to really build a robust theory of change. More than 15 can make it difficult for all voices to be heard and for the team to effectively engage. We really do encourage our teams to think about engaging interested parties in these exercises, bringing those interested parties to the table, but also trust that our teams will be able to recognize when that is or is not appropriate. Where it isn't sort of appropriate to bring those voices literally into the module itself, we really do encourage teams to make sure that those voices are heard. And that can be, reaching out beforehand through something like an empathy interview process. And it can also be taking a draft theory of change out onto the road afterwards and making sure we get the perspectives of additional staff from within the Nature Conservancy and certainly the perspectives of those key interested parties as well, and use that information then to refine and to further shape that theory of change. So let's talk quickly then about what are the major steps involved in this module. Typically, teams undertake the module in a 3-workshop series, each workshop being about 3 to 4 hours, so a morning or an afternoon session spread over a 3-day period. In the first of those workshops, then the team really articulates that context. They describe the challenges they're looking to solve, they list out the key interested parties that need to be engaged or might be affected by the issue, and they specify their goals and their outcomes, what success looks like. In the second day then, that's really where they begin to build out their hypothesis for how the strategic approach and the actions they're thinking that they're going to take will lead to the change that they hope to see, and begin to think about sort of what is that cause and effect logic. How do we expect this action will lead to something, that will lead to something else, will eventually lead to the success we want to see, and then use that storytelling to hone in on those assumptions. It also allows the team to begin a process of saying which of these assumptions are most important. And that's a combination of which of our assumptions do we have sort of least evidence for, where we're most uncertain about whether or not it's valid, and which of those assumptions, if it isn't valid, really might influence the likelihood of the strategy being successful. So we begin to hone in then in that second step. And then in the third step, we take those assumptions that seem most important and we translate them into intermediate results. And this is where we begin to think about how would we actually collect data? How will we actually evaluate whether or not that assumption is valid in a feasible way and essentially as quickly as we can, so that we don't continue to put resources behind work that is not on track for success. So in terms of the key products that come out of the theory of change module, the first is that you have that first draft theory of change. Most teams undertake this using Mural as a virtual whiteboard, some do it in person. The majority of teams then translate that Mural board or that conversation into a PowerPoint slide deck that is an accessible format for the team themselves and to share with others. Also, the team will come out with a list of prioritized intermediate results, but they should think of this as sort of a first step rather than a final list of well-crafted intermediate results. Most teams have a little bit more work to do after the theory of change workshop. So in terms of how the teams then continue onwards once they've completed the theory of change, assuming that they wish to do so, we have found that for some teams, really what they're looking to do is to improve upon those intermediate results coming out of the theory of change. And as such, we've developed some standalone guidance that takes a couple of hours for teams to continue to refine, to continue to improve their intermediate results. Many teams then do step onto our monitoring, evaluation, and learning module, and that is really where you come out with a discrete list of learning agenda questions based on your intermediate results and a solid plan for how you're actually going to be implementing those, gathering those data, and using as a basis for adaptive management. So thank you so much for your time today. I do hope that this overview has been helpful to you. If you do want to continue on this journey to learn more, really encourage you to check out our conservationbydesign.org website. You'll find information about the modules. You can dig as deep as you would like on the theory of change and all of the rest of the modules as well. And really do encourage you to continue with this journey. Thank you so much.